Fran's from New York.
Hi, I'm Fran. I'm an addict. It's amazing. I moved from New York to Kona a few years ago, and absolutely convinced that I'll never lose my accent. And I work at a high school with adolescents, and they keep trying to tell me they don't even have an R in their alphabet, and every word I know ends with an R. You know, that's that New York that I'll never lose. But first of all, I'd like to thank the committee for asking me to come for a lot of reasons, but this is a real special week for me. Usually I always say I'm not going to do a war story, I'm going to do the steps, but I want to do something very different tonight. I want to give you a little bit of me, of what was at one time. I came from the Bronx. I came from a neighborhood where there was no drugs. I went to Catholic school, and any trouble I wanted, I had to even leave the neighborhood to get it. So it wasn't growing up in New York in a bad neighborhood or anything. 11 years of Catholic school. I mean, that I kid about. I think that was the beginning of my problems. Catholicism did wonders on me. But I always remember feeling like I didn't belong. And I thought I had to be adopted, because if I wasn't, they would have loved me more. And they didn't mistreat me. There was just nothing. And in 1948, there was an epidemic in New York of polio, and I got it, and I was paralyzed, and I was sent away to a hospital for a year. And at that time, they said I would never walk again. And I think it was the beginning of my drug use, because we got a lot of drugs in those years for the pain. And I didn't connect what I felt good about, but I knew I felt happier in the hospital than I ever felt before. I was just too young to connect that to drugs yet. And I came out, and I was a horror show. And I began to be a horror show the rest of my life, my young life anyway. And when I was about 16, a lot of my friends had already been into drinking and drugging and everything else, and I hadn't. And I can remember the night that I decided I wanted to drink. And I also know exactly what was going on in my head. I didn't want to drink. I wanted to get drunk. So it wasn't even about, let me taste this. I knew where I wanted to go, and that's where I went. Now, I wish I could say drugs then came into my life and drugs took me out to the streets, but that's not the way it happened for me. I was addicted to lying, stealing, and manipulating long before I ever touched a drug. And at 14, I used to tell people I wanted to be a nun. And I really think that's kind of normal for Catholic school. At 16, I was giving birth to my first daughter. At 17, I was giving birth to my second daughter. And by 18, I was doing time in the Women's House of Detention for prostitution. So I had jumped from a nun to a hooker in the matter of 3 years. So it kind of shows how fast I was going down. After my second child, I was all of 17 and decided this isn't what I want, because I didn't know what to do with them. So I took off. And I went down to Manhattan, and I made a conscious decision to be a hooker. I went to this bar, and I saw these hookers, and I saw all these men hanging around them and giving them money, and all I knew is that's what I want. I want that attention, and I want the money. So out I go, and the one thing, it shows you the mentality I had, the one thing that bothered me was I would see women in their early 30s looking like they're 50. Hookers aged real bad. And I had this crazy idea that the reason they aged is they didn't eat right and they didn't sleep right. That it was really the hours they kept, not what they were doing. So I went and found a doctor. And I said, okay, it's real important that I sleep 8 hours every night. So he gave me sleeping pills. But then what was started to happen was in the morning when I had to go to work hooking, I was groggy. So I go back to the doctor. I says, you have to give me something to wake up in the morning. So the parade began. And I think the only thing those days that was in my favor was I really knew I was nuts. There wasn't any doubt in my mind that I was crazy. So I knew not to go up. I had to be kept down. So any drug I touched went down. There was never would I have touched crack, cocaine, or crack. It wasn't around, but it wouldn't have been my choices. I had to be calmed down compared to where I was. I started doing time. I don't remember. It's funny, I got away with it for a long time. But like most of us, after the first bust came, they came back to back. And I would be going in and out of jail. And the first time in, I was scared shit. I wasn't a street person. I didn't come from the streets. And I can remember somebody in the jail saying to me, "You have to act nuts." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "If you're crazy, they'll put you on the pay me no mind list. So you have to be crazy and they won't bother you." And I really believed in the beginning that it was an act, that I was just acting nuts. And somehow I knew I crossed a line and it wasn't an act anymore. It really was who I was. And all of a sudden, jail wasn't scary anymore. Jail was real comfortable. And I don't know what it's like anyplace else, but in New York, there was one main place the women all went through. And in the morning, when we all met to go to court, you thought you were home. Hey, how's your kid? Did your mother have the operation? Because you haven't seen them since the last time you were in jail with them. So you caught up on everybody's family. And it was a real comfortable place to be. And I always knew I was cleaned up. I didn't have to have as much drugs when I got out. And each time it was, I'm going to cut down now. Now I'm clean, so I'm going to cut down on what I use. Well, I never cut down. Then it became, no more jail. I'm really not coming back here anymore. I'm going to stop. And honest to God, I meant it with all my heart. Each time I came out, I swore I wasn't going to go back. And in no time, I was back on a new cross charge. And something began to happen. A lot of rage started to build up out there. And I got a point in my life where I knew if another man touched me, I was going to kill him. So I knew the life was over for me. So you move on. And then we got into some forgery, and then we got into some robberies, and finally I put the pistol in my hand and I hurt 2 people before I was finished. And when I got finished, it's hard for me sometimes listening to people in NA when they're sharing at a meeting or sharing a story, because I feel different. Everybody always talks about partying, and they use the word party. I don't ever remember drugs being a party for me. Drugs were a way of life, and it stopped me from getting sick in the morning, but it wasn't a party. I never went to parties. My day consisted of committing crimes to get the money, to get the drugs. Next day, get up, commit the crimes, get the money, get the drugs. I didn't go to parties. I didn't go to dances. I didn't do any of that. So I get a little lost about maybe envy that at least before some of you hit a bottom, you partied. I didn't party. It was a way of survival for me. So I ended up in California, and I ended up in the penal system in the state of California. Started out in civil brand, then went on to California Institution for Women. And when they got me there, they decided that I should not be put into population. There were 30 women there that were considered not fit for population. So we got put in the psychiatric treatment unit, and it was called the Institution for the Criminally Insane. And somehow they had this crazy idea that I belonged there. So I never hit population in the joint. I stayed in this nut house. Now, a lot of strange things happened for me there. One, it's the first time I've ever stayed clean. And it had nothing to do with not having access to drugs. I had access to any drugs I wanted. But in this particular unit, Out of the 30 of us, 15 were probably real sick women that belonged in a mental institution, and I felt really bad that they were there. The other 15 of us were considered management cases. We were considered too dangerous to go in population that we would start trouble. So the only reason I didn't get high is I was locked up with 15 of the most dangerous bitches I'll ever cross paths with. So it wasn't the kind of atmosphere where you wanted to come out of your cell stoned. You had to come out of your cell every morning and watch your back every hour of that morning. And just like the hospital, all of a sudden I felt at home again. I can't tell you how happy I was in that prison. I was safe, I was clean, I was away from a world that I couldn't live in. But something else happened. Where I was in my life at that point was I was going to rebel against anything that existed. That's who I was. It just so happened society made the mistake of locking me up in an institution that was 100% wrong. So when I rebelled, for the first time in my life, I became the right one. I started to fight for inmates' rights. I started to fight for programs. It was a whole new me doing a war. But I was still fighting with that society. And finally, November 10th, 1966, they were going to cut me loose. I was told over and over not to ask for out-of-state parole, to stay in California, away from everything I knew back east, and try to make a go of it, but I wouldn't listen. I said, nope, so I applied to go back to New York, and it was granted. So out I come, same story, never again. I'm just not going to do this ever again. And I guess the strangest thing in the world happened. I was a goddamn walking disaster, but I never got high again. But that's the only thing I did right. I was coming home on a plane knowing that 2 kids who were 10 and 11 years old, who I never raised, were going to pick me up at this airport. Now there's a man that every November 10th I think about him. I wish I knew his name. I was on the plane coming back. It was a 3-seater. I was sitting at the window. There was an empty seat, and there was a man on the aisle. So we started to talk on this 6-hour ride, and I made up some story about why I was in California, that I was a secretary, and I was there on some work, and I was coming back. I mean, I invented a person, a career. It was wonderful. And about halfway here, back to the East Coast rather, I start to panic about these kids. And out of the clear blue sky, I look over at this man. I said, I have something to tell you. I just lied to you. And he said, yeah. I said, I'm not a secretary. I just walked out of prison. And I'm looking at this guy. I thought he was going to choke on his food. And he said, can I ask you why you were there? Well, we get in this whole conversation the whole rest of the way. We land in Newark, New Jersey. And I got off, and my kids and the thing in my head is, I kept getting that far. I kept imagining getting off the plane, seeing my kids, but it stopped there. What the fuck do I say? Hi, kids, I've been gone 10 years, sorry about that. I didn't know what to do. And when we got off the plane and went to get my luggage, he showed up at the luggage place, and he said, that's the kids, huh? And I said, yeah. And he says, they look like you, and good luck. And the next thing he said is, my mother is never going to believe this story. And every November, I think about him, because I realized that he helped me make that trip back home. It was someone to vomit all over, it was all coming out. I came home, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't get a job, I couldn't function, I couldn't have a driver's license. So the new war began. Now I began fighting with the parole department. Told me I couldn't have a driver's license, so I'm trying to make some sense out of that. And they said anybody who used a car in the commission of their crime could not have a license. So I looked at them, I said, this is good. So you think if I'm going out on an armed robbery and I put a pistol in my hand, I'm not going to go because I don't have a driver's license? I mean, is this really? So it was kind of fighting for what I thought was just common sense stuff, And the war began. So I got my driver's license. Then the next episode, you have to understand New York. I had to do parole for 2 states. I had to do California's parole and New York's parole. Now, New York had a beaut. No sexual intercourse with anyone except your legal husband or wife. Now, the men were getting away with it, but it wasn't days where we had legal abortions, and if a woman got pregnant, she got violated and sent back to prison because it was proof she violated her parole. So what we began doing is going to an office on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, because you know what state workers are like, they like to leave early. And we got every ex-con we could find, and we would begin calling the parole department, asking permission to have sex that weekend, until we could keep them there, and we won that war. So I was on a new kick. But the harder the world got for me, the more I wanted to go back to that prison, because I was so fucking safe back there. I couldn't handle the kids. I can remember days in the winter where it would be freezing cold and snowing, and my neighbor would come along, and I'd be sitting outside in boots and a heavy winter coat and a hat and gloves having a cup of tea. And they'd say to me, "What are you doing sitting out here?" And I said, "I want to hurt her." My kid would have driven me crazy, and I was at a point in my life, and that's where I was when I ended up in prison, that when I snapped, I couldn't stop until I saw blood. Something about seeing blood made it okay for me. So I had to cut people, I had to shoot people, and I knew I felt no different about my kids. The only difference was I had enough sense to walk the fuck out of that house before I hurt her. So I'd be sitting out in the freezing cold. But I knew I didn't want to live like this. And I happened to pick up a newspaper one night, and I read about a group of ex-convicts. And I didn't believe they were doing anything good, but there was this great robbery that I had planned in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and I needed a driver. So where are you going to find a driver? Where a bunch of ex-convicts were. So I made the phone call, and it was the first time I think I ever felt at home. They were terrific. And what they were about is helping people they left behind. And first I thought they were full of shit. And then one of the guys said to me, "So how many women did you promise to write to? How many women did you promise you'd send a package back to and you haven't done shit?" And they were right. That's exactly what I had done. So I kind of joined the war. And at that time it was all men and me. And I realized how hard it was for a woman. You see, guys could come out of prison in those days and stand up and say they were an ex-convict, and women found something very attractive about that. There wasn't anything attractive about the ex-hooker, the ex-thief. There's nothing attractive about a woman that way. And then one female came back that had been there before, and we worked together, and I came to work one day, and she said, "I can't stand you another minute. Put your coat on. We're going to a meeting." I had no idea what she was talking about. And there was no NA in New York in those days. And she took me to a meeting, and I was real disappointed. First of all, I heard people laughing at this sad story, and I didn't get it. I didn't know why people were laughing at this. If I had denial about being an addict, I had more denial about being an alcoholic, because booze wasn't my thing, so I had no idea why I was there. And when we came out, she said, "We're going to keep coming back here." And you know, without ever knowing I was ready, I must have been, because I kept going back. I hated it. I hated those people, but I kept going back. But it was a lot of years ago, and it was not good years for us in that other fellowship. I wasn't allowed to share, and I wasn't allowed to closed meetings. I could only come to beginners meetings, and I had to sit. They did not want an addict in the rooms. So I kept going, and sometimes I always think, why did I keep going back? And I think it was that rebellion one more time to say, "Fuck you, I'm here, and we're going to put up with this." Finally, in my 5th year of recovery, I want you to know I'm getting better now, right? 5 years. I married an active addict. That's when I got better. So we won't even discuss who I married before I got better. So I get married. It lasted 3 months. That was a long relationship for me. But it got me nutty enough to have another addict in my life that I went to a fellowship for families. And you know what? They didn't care that I was an addict. They didn't care about, I was allowed to share. I was allowed to do everything I needed to do, and my healing began. I feel sad that The 12-step program where I belonged, I couldn't heal, but there I was with a group of families, and they were taking care of me. And it was a real safe place for me to be. Finally, one of my very, very best friends went back out. We worked together, we hung together, and she went out real, real bad. And I was trying to get her back in, and it was amazing to see what happened. This was an old-time dope fiend and a heroin user for years, and she picked up that fucking crack. And it took her in months where heroin couldn't take her in years. And I watched her get nuts. And then an old friend of mine said, "Hey, did you ever hear of NA?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, guess what? They're in New York." And I said, "Well, where are they?" I said, "We don't know. They're underground. We got to find them." There was 3 meetings in New York at that time. And I started taking her to those meetings. And first, she would stay until the break, and she'd leave, and I'd go with her. And then she started leaving before the break, but I stopped going and leaving with her. I stayed. And then before you know it, I was staying for the whole meeting, and she wasn't there anymore. And she said to me one day, "You know you're not going here for me anymore, don't you?" And I smiled, and I said, "Yeah, I know." I wish I could describe what happened to my life from then on in. I was 17 years clean when I walked into the rooms of NA. And that's all I was drug-free. I wasn't anything else. My life had been a disaster. Those 17 years, how I made it, I don't have the slightest idea. My first couple of years in recovery were real interesting, and I always talk about them because I think we need to have a lot of tolerance for newcomers. But I'm going to show you how nuts I was. When I was clean about 9 months, my sponsor, it was summertime, she was outside of a meeting, and I pulled up driving a Cadillac. And I parked the car, and I got out, and she's looking at me, and she said to me, "Where'd you get the car?" And I said, "It's my boss's car. I had a job now, right?" So she said, "Your boss gives you a Cadillac to ride around at night and go to a meeting?" I said, "Yeah, he's a trick." She says, "What do you mean he's a trick?" I said, "He's a John." She goes, "Fran, are you still turning tricks?" I said, "Yeah." She says, "No, Fran, you can't do that in here." I said, "Okay." So I stopped. I had about 15 months clean when I was at a meeting and she asked me to come outside. She says, "Listen, one of the women was standing there when you opened up your pocketbook to get out your cigarettes." I said, "Yeah." She says, "She saw a pistol." I said, "Yeah." She says, "What's the gun for?" I said, "The robberies." She asked me what robberies, and I explained that's how I pay my bills and my rent. And then she told me, "You can't be doing that in here, Fran." I didn't know what the hell you did in here. But I got to tell you what I heard when I walked in the door. What I heard from you, which is a lie we tell every goddamn newcomer walking in the door. All you have to do is don't pick up and go to a meeting. That's exactly what I did. I didn't pick up, and I went to a meeting. Nobody ever said to me, "Fran, you got to change your whole fucking life." And I'm glad you didn't tell me that, because I probably would have ran. So you lied to me, and I stayed. Then it got to a point where some changes had to happen. So they happened very slowly. To show you how slowly, I think I had 19 years when I spoke at the World Convention. And it was the first year of my recovery that I could get up in a group of people and say, "This year I stopped lying." It took me that long. And what I realized and learned along the way is I came from an alcoholic home. I came from, I call us the children of the lie. I had been raised to lie. I was taught to lie. It was a way of life. And just because I got clean, my way of life wasn't leaving me. And 19 years into recovery, I finally stopped lying. But the day I walked into the meetings of NA, I can't begin to tell you how my entire life changed. Because up until that point, I kept dealing with the drug. And what I realized finally was that was the easiest thing I was going to give up. The easiest. Because I could remain abstinent from that. It was all the rest I couldn't get. When I looked at our first step, there are fellowships that said they're powerless over pills, they're powerless over alcohol, they're powerless over food, they're powerless over everything. We were the only ones that said we were powerless over our addiction. And all of a sudden what I realized is I wasn't just somebody who got high. I was addicted. First of all, if you see me walking around, to this day, there's a cup in my hand. The cup is filled with tea. It is filled with tea all day long. I drink 20 cups of tea a day. When I smoked, I didn't smoke one cigarette. I smoked 2 packs a day. I was absolutely addicted to relationships, to people pleasing, and I realized I have the ability of abusing this shit out of anything that can be abused. And that's what it meant for this person to be an addict. It had so little to do with the goddamn drugs. I wish I could say my bottom was a drug. It wasn't. My drugs never took me to my bottom. I was one of those people that even when I cleaned up, I had to wake up waiting. That's not very bad. You know, I know everybody else, they lost that ability. I never lost it. The emotional pain of what I was doing took me to my bottom. I couldn't handle the pain anymore. When I started into the fellowship, I used to ask my sponsor about the steps. She said, no good, leave them alone. I want you to come to a meeting. And then I'd see everybody else doing steps. I'd say, everybody else is doing steps, not you. Just come to a meeting. So finally one day, I got mad at her. And she said to me, Fran, you're too sick to do the steps. You need to learn how to stay clean and just be. Don't go near the steps. Just come to a meeting. Now, I really thought she was kind of nuts. You know, I was so crazy that I didn't know I was crazy. And sometimes I forget how crazy I was. And in the beginning, I'd watch people with 5 years being someplace with their steps and their recovery, that 10 years I wasn't there yet. And I'd envy that. And thank God I had people in my life who remembered when I walked in, and they'd say to me, Fran, stop comparing. Not everybody walked out of the doors of the institution for the criminally insane. Stop pushing it. She was a very smart lady. And finally, when the steps came into my life, real gentle, they began to work for me. I understood what it was to be powerless. I got real hung up on this God shit. You know, it wasn't my thing. And then I had people telling me, it's not about God. And there's that rebel. It's not about God. What the hell's it doing written on our shades? Get the word off. You know, I wanted nothing to do with God. And what I finally realized is I always had a faith. I had faith that dope was good. I had faith I wasn't going to get busted. There was always faith. Maybe in the wrong things. What I realized is a word was stopping me. So I changed the word. So my higher power's name is Harry, and Harry and I have a terrific relationship and a wonderful communication. And all it was a word. It wasn't about a belief. And then I heard from my sponsor the shit that my sponsees have heard over and over and hate. That this was a program of suggestions. That's all it is. There's no rules here. But she used to tell me, I'll tell you one thing. For every suggestion you don't take, you're going to pay a price. And the price is going to get higher and higher. And when you're sick and tired of paying the price, come on back and take the suggestion. It's waiting for you. Did I listen? Absolutely not. I took no suggestions. I paid the price every goddamn time. And then I'd come back and say, okay. Some things like that have never changed. I wish I could say I'm one of these people that get up every morning and turn my life and my will over to a higher power. Absolutely never happened. I get up and for the first half hour, sometimes I make 45 minutes, I run totally on self-will. And usually within 45 minutes I'm a little nuts. And at that point I can stop and say, okay, stupid, It's not going to work today either, just like it hasn't worked for the last 30 years. But all right, A for effort. Every morning I give a try. I'm not somebody who ever got on my knees and prayed. It's just not my thing. If you pray and that works for you, damn it, you better keep doing it. But whatever works for you, praying just didn't work for me. And I remember one time when I was with someone from NA, and I stopped in a church on 42nd Street because I was having a rough time. And I don't ever care what kind of a church I go into. I just like to go into churches because it's quiet there. And I went in, and I didn't realize I was kind of talking out loud, and he heard me. And I looked up at the altar, and I said, listen, you, I think you're out in a goddamn slip because there's a lot of shit coming down the pike. And then I get quiet, and then I look back up. I said, listen, you motherfucker, if I get through this one, you owe me one. So we left the church, and as we walk outside, he looked at me and he goes, Fran, is that the way you pray? I said, yeah. But you know what? When I came into recovery, they told me I had a higher power who loved me no matter what. Didn't mean I had to change that when I came in. It meant whoever I am, it's okay. And I had a very spiritual higher power. It just wasn't what everybody else called it. The steps came into my life exactly the way they were supposed to, just like the people do. It took a lot of years to learn I needed to stop being Otto Preminger and stop directing. And I need to get the fuck out of my life, turn it over, and let it happen. Sometimes this scares people, but it's probably the most honest thing I could say. When I had 15 years clean, life started to get better. When I had 20 years clean, I started to get better. Now, it doesn't always work that way for some people. Some people, their life gets better, before the outside. My outside worked first. I got a job, I put it together. Everything on the outside went together before the inside did. According to the rest of the world, my outside would have looked terrific. But I had these 2 kids I couldn't handle. And it took a while before we came to grips with each other. My oldest one, I guess, is probably the most painful if I really want to be honest with it. You see, she was a good kid. So I didn't know how to deal with her. I didn't know what the fuck you did with a good kid. The other one was just like me, so that was a breeze. I mean, we were 2 people very much alike. But here's this other one in the house, that I just didn't know what to do with. She didn't swear, she didn't do anything. So we kind of had a thing between us that was not going to be okay. We kind of survived each other. I did not realize at that time the pain that I caused in her life. You see, when I got into recovery, one of my goals was to get the rest of the world into recovery. I was going to clean up everybody. Mother Teresa had nothing on me. And what I used to do is bring home ex-convicts who just got out of prison that day, bring home addicts. Here's this square kid that is petrified of every person I walked through that door. So there was a lot of trauma in that kid's life. The other one would greet them at the door. Oh, you just get out of the joint today? What'd you do? I mean, she was street. When the younger one was 16, she picked up alcohol. Within 24 hours, she went to drugs. And she was an addict from the day she picked up. And I went to war with her. It was horrible. I think we spent 2 years wasted hating each other. Me trying to control her addiction and me trying to get out of my sight. Finally, I went back to that fellowship where I belonged with families, and her and I came to peace. I stopped trying to control her life, but I needed to go back there where I needed to be. And we really ended up the best we could ever be with each other. And when I began doing the steps, I did them in order like I was supposed to. It took me quite a few years. I laughed at making my list of amends because I started the list with the ones the closest to me and then went on to everybody. But when I started to make amends, I started on the other end. I started with the people the most removed from me because that wasn't so painful. I could kind of ease my way in. And I got down to the close ones, and I finally got down to my kids. And the night that I was going to talk to Patty, she showed up, and I'd been crying because I knew this was it. It's time. I mean, God, she's 20 years old, more than time. And she came in that night, and she was high, not bad, but she was high, and she knew I'd been crying. And she asked me what was wrong, and I said, we need to talk. Now, let me tell you the sad thing about my kids. I could pick up a guy on the streets, bring him home, lay up with him, I don't even know his fucking name, lay up with him and tell him I love him. I couldn't touch my kids. I couldn't put my arms around them, I couldn't touch them, and I couldn't tell them I loved them. And it took a lot of years to realize I didn't give a shit about what the stranger did, but I gave a shit about what they did. And I couldn't have taken the rejection, so I kept myself very safe. And that night, Patty and I sat and I cried. And I told her that I was sorry for everything that had ever happened. And that I wish I could turn that fucking clock back and undo it, but I couldn't. And that it's over, I've done it. And that I was trying my best to do the best I could in life today. And I felt awful that she had gotten that disease. And she hugged me crying, saying that she never blamed me. I always thought, well, she didn't have to. I did enough. I did a good job of that. But she didn't blame me, and she felt luckier than most people, because if she decided to do something about it, she knew where to go. I had opened up that door for her. She just wasn't planning on doing anything about it. And it was the first night that I think we ever hugged. And I put my arms around her and told her I loved her, and she told me she loved me. And she left. And 24 hours later, I got the phone call that she was dead of an overdose. And whenever I think about the call that night, I always remember what I did. And what I did is I hung up the phone, and I looked up to the sky, and I said, thank you for last night. Thank you that I don't have to live the rest of my fucking life wondering, why didn't I ever tell her I was sorry? And why didn't I ever tell her I loved her? I had done it. And now it became important to me to let other people know how I felt. But knowing it and doing it were two different things. I couldn't do it. I really had a rough time. You see, I'm okay with that tough side of me, but God damn it, I'm not okay with that soft side. So the people that were the closest to me were my sponsees. So let me tell you how I dealt with them. I called them every kind of dizzy bitch in the world, and that meant I loved you. If I didn't like you, I didn't curse you out. So I had this warped thing about what was going to happen if I liked you. You got abused. You got abused bad. And I really made an effort, but there was this hole in my gut from Patty that I thought would never, ever get filled. And when they said, stay around and it gets better beyond your wildest dreams, it's exactly what happened. I had another daughter. I had two more daughters. One was born in prison, and I gave her up for adoption. And that was my choice to do. And I went to a lot of conventions. And one of the things that I connect the conventions to is my 12th step. I don't know what the hell a spiritual awakening is, and I figure out as I'm leaving this world into the next, I'm going to realize what a spiritual awakening is. But I've had spiritual experiences, and they were always connected to conventions. And one of the things that happened that had nothing to do with conventions, my oldest daughter ended up adopting 2 children. And I sucked as a mother, really bad. I can't tell you what a terrific grandmother I was. I did things with these kids that I never did with my own. I went roller skating in the roller rink. I did everything there was. And I loved being a grandma. But I also understood the reason I loved being a grandma is I could drop them off and leave. You know, it wasn't my responsibility, but I loved these kids. The other thing that happened is I realized I could now do for my daughter's kids what I could never do for her. So I had a chance to do this again. And I don't know a whole lot of people that get that chance. So I started going to conventions, and I had a sponsee who I knew had AIDS, and she wouldn't go get tested, and I kept fighting with her. And finally she called me up one night. She was ready to go for the test, and she called me up and she said, "Fran, please don't get mad at me, but I'm not going to go get tested." And I said, "What happened? I thought we were set." She lived with this guy, and he told her, "If you go to get tested, you have to leave. I'm not going to live with you." And she said probably the best thing she could have said to me that night. She said, "I'm more afraid of being alone than I am of dying." And I understood that, because I've been there. So I said, "Okay," and I hung up, and I was sitting there crying because I felt she made a decision to commit suicide. And the phone rang. Within 15 minutes, the phone rang. And I answered the phone crying, and there was this voice saying, "Hello, we've called to ask you to come speak at our convention, and we're from Oshkosh, Wisconsin." So I busted out laughing because I never knew there was a place called Oshkosh, Wisconsin. I said yes, and I thanked him for the call because he pulled me out of my mood. And off I go to Oshkosh, and I was kidding with everybody in New York saying, "I can't imagine what the fuck I'm going to do in Oshkosh. The cows must be shooting dope." I couldn't even imagine who would be there who used. So I go off to Oshkosh, and I go to this meeting during the day, and this young man gets up, and his name was Mark, and he talked about grief, that he'd been given up for adoption as a child, and when he was 18, he went on a hunt for his birth mother, and when he found her, she had been dead 10 years already. And he said, "I kind of got left with, why didn't she love me? Why didn't she care? What was wrong with me?" So when I shared at the banquet that night, I talked about one of the things I did in my recovery was to sign up with Alma, because I gave a child up for adoption. And I was willing to go ahead if that child wanted to find me because I believed she had the right to her heritage. She had a right to understand who she was, and she had a right to know that I have no regrets that I gave her up, because I had no intentions of cleaning up my life, and I had already destroyed 2 kids, didn't need to destroy the next one. But I finally loved another human being enough to do what was needed to be done for them, not for me. And he cried. And that night he came up and he said to me, "You'll never know what you did for my recovery. It never dawned on me that she gave me up because she loved me." And I said, "Mark, you'll never know what you did for my recovery, because now I know why I'm in Oshkosh, Wisconsin." And it was for Mark. And that's those spiritual experiences that happen. And then I got asked to come to Phoenix, Arizona. I was all excited. I'm going to go off to Phoenix. And I was in therapy at the time. So I go into my therapist and I say, "Hey, going to Phoenix, Arizona." Bap, bap, bap. And she goes, "No, you're not." She was a little aggressive. So I said, "What do you mean I'm not going?" She said, "You just finished your master's degree, and that's the weekend of your graduation. And you have never accepted credit for anything you've done, and your ass is walking up on that stage, and you're taking that diploma, and you call up Phoenix and tell them you're not coming." I said, "Okay." So I called up Phoenix and said, "Sorry, I can't come." So a year later, I get a phone call from Arizona. They said, "Gee, this year it's in Tucson. Will you come?" I said, "Sure." And off I go to Tucson. And at an NA convention in Tucson, Arizona, I met the daughter who I gave up for adoption 24 years before. So I ended up in Tucson exactly when I was supposed to be there. And when more and more of those experiences started to happen, I started to learn to get out of my own way. And a peace started to come. And when I left New York, I had a job that I loved. I mean, I just wanted to go to work every day. I went out on the streets and I did HIV testing for the hookers on the street who were homeless and substance abusers. I loved them. I had a ball with them. And I got offered a job here in Kona, and John and I both talked about it, and somehow I knew. And before I worked with the hookers, I worked with a bunch of Vietnam vets, nuts on the goddamn railroad. And when I left them to go work with the women, I felt real bad. And one of them said to me, "Fran, your job here is finished. And it's obvious that the women need you a little more than us." And then when I left the hookers to come here and work with the kids, that's what helped me make the transition. My job there's finished. It's time to go to my next one. I didn't go begging. Doors opened up. I was going to get laid off September 30th, and we were kind of worried. And I know this is making fun of him, but I don't pray, and my husband does. And he was 10 times more worried than me about losing the job. I was there of, nah, it's going to happen. I have been taken care of. There is no doubt. I'm going to be fine, and it's going to happen for me. I'll get a job. We won't discuss how many jobs I ended up with. I had the opportunity in NA to travel all over the world. I've spoken at conventions in most states. How I ended up in Kona was I was speaking in Cheyenne. John Wayne would have turned over in his grave knowing all the addicts were meeting there. But we were going to Cheyenne, and I was in Denver, changing planes, and I see this guy, tan, shorts, sandals, NA shirt. So I go over and I meet him to find out he's going to Cheyenne. So off we go, and we had a ball with each other. He'd get up in the morning like a lunatic, and he'd go out running, and I'd go down and have breakfast and find this fruit, and I'd leave it in front of his door that he had the fruit, because God forbid he shouldn't eat. I already became his mother. And one of the things that happened that weekend is his last words to me were, "If it's the last thing I do, I'm going to get you to speak in Oahu." Not that he's a controlling person. But 2 years later, I was speaking in Oahu. I don't even think he was on the committee, and he had it happen. And when we got there, we traveled all over to the different islands, because we thought it would be the only time we came. And we shared a cabin with Brenda and Richie. And we ended up going out to dinner, and Mary and Biff were there. And the people we met there were the people that we went to live with. We ended up moving to Kona because somehow we knew it was home and it was time. And I've gotten a job here, and I absolutely love it. I love my job, I love where I live, I love NA, and I had this ball of energy that just wouldn't stop. And on June 24th, I went out to lunch with Mary. And I walked into a restaurant, and I went to order, and I couldn't order. And I kept trying, and I couldn't. And I can remember Mary looking at me and saying, "Are you okay?" And I shook my head, no. And she said, "Do we need to go to a hospital?" And I shook my head, yeah. And off we went. And I'd had a stroke. Now, for those people that know me, it was kind of humorous, because after I was okay, we realized if the stroke didn't kill me, not talking was going to fucking kill me. But things had evolved in my life by then. I was in a relationship for a lot of years. Finally worked real hard on that one, and realized relationships can be the best or the worst part of your recovery. You can give up, or they can make you work the steps like you never worked them in your fucking life. Sometimes, in trying to describe relationships, the best way I could describe what a normal relationship, because we don't know what normal is that there are nights that we're sitting down watching TV, and I look over at him, and this warm feeling comes, and I just look at him, and there's no doubt in my heart why I love him, that he's just this warm, terrific person in my life. 2 nights later, I could be sitting in the same chair. This man has not done one single thing different or said a word, and I'm sitting there staring at the same person saying, what the fuck am I doing here? And I realized that that's the normal stuff. I think we expect to kiss and live happy ever after. You don't realize that there's stuff, and sometimes it's hours, and I'm good. I don't let it come out of my mouth. In February, we had a new addition to our family, and a young lady came to live with us. And I had been involved before with foster care, but John took one look at me and the way I dealt with this kid, and he used to go around teasing. He'd say, this one's going to break your heart, this one's going to break your heart, because this one was different. Sometimes I kid her that she has to be part of my blood because we're both so dizzy. So being in the house, sometimes John gets mad at us and says he feels like he's living with Dumb and Dumber, and we both look at him and we point and say, dumbest, because he lives with us. But she became a very, very special part of my life. Now there's times we absolutely adore each other, and there's times we both wish we were 5,000 miles apart from each other, and we've learned that's normal. We had this couple that John worked with, and the man had a stroke, and his wife was talking to John, and John said to me, don't talk to her. She's going to get you depressed. Don't talk to her. So finally I did. And one of the things she said to me is, Fran, it will never again be the same. And lo and behold, I've come to accept that it will never again be the same. I have to go home in the daytime and lay down and take a nap. When I first had the stroke, I went on the internet thinking, well, okay, I'm not allowed to go to a meeting, I can't talk, I'll go to the meeting on the internet. And I pull it up on the internet and I get so excited, right? And I went to type to find out that I typed the words, I spelt them the way I was trying to say them. I couldn't do it. So guess what? I got stuck sitting at a meeting with my mouth shut and just listening. There was nothing else I could do. And believe it or not, I became okay with it. I became okay with some of the restrictions that have come into my life. I go to meetings and I share about it a lot, that I can't take phone calls at night, because at night I lose the ability to use some of my words. And I don't care how many times I say that, my phone still rings at night. So I'm having a better time adjusting to the stroke than people around me are. They're making believe it didn't happen, and I'm doing okay. So I've gone to the next step. I don't answer the phone anymore at night. The message machine does. So I'm trying to learn to take care of me. This is the second convention I've spoken at since the stroke, and I make Mary sit at the corner because sometimes I lose the words, and she's got to feed them to me. There are people that I've met while I've traveled that have meant more to me. You know, when Tom came into my life in Denver, I don't think either one of us knew how much we'd be intertwined in our lives. He went off to India. There's another man in my life. His name is Father Dan Egan. He's been in my life for 35 years. He's the junkie priest. And Dan's pretty much dying, and he's a real special man. Tom goes off to India, and he comes back and he said, your ears should have been burning. We were talking about you. And I said, who? He said, in India, I met Father Dan. So here's the two men in my life meeting up in this God-forsaken country thousands of miles away. I don't think things like that are an accident. I really, in all my heart, believe when the student's ready, the teacher will arrive. And that everybody who crosses our path teaches us a lesson. I could hate your guts. You're going to teach me how to be tolerant. There's a lesson to be learned, no matter who it is. The people I became real comfortable with here were the people that had the most time. Because, see, I always knew I was nuts. But back in the East Coast, I was the only one who had time, and they wanted me to be well. Well, then I come and meet the Holy Foursome here. I meet Tom, who's now from Hilo. People think he walks on water. Then I meet the other Tom. They think he's the second coming of Christ in Paris. Then I meet Larry, who we just abused the living shit out of, and I have no idea why he even talks to us, because we kill him. But when you start, where's Mac? I don't even know where he is. When you start in knowing that they have that kind of time, oh, see, the other sicko is here. Mac's here. When you start to meet people like that who have time, I realize I'm not so bad. Okay? What I love is their sponsees are not ready for my sense of humor. One of their sponsees will mention Tom and say, he's a sick bastard. Fran, that's my sponsor. Don't talk about him like that. But it's the way, but you know what's great? No matter what, they're always there for me. It's the people I can call and say, I'm nuts. John gets worried because the other Tom's got me reading books about Buddhism. John's convinced I'm gone altogether now. I'm joining the other world of Tom Canton. We're going down another world. But they've been good. Everybody entered my life. I find it amazing that I came out of the best hospitals in the world in New York City, and I ended up having a stroke in Kona, where my doctor is my best friend. The woman who took me to the hospital is my best friend, and I couldn't have gotten better care in any hospital in New York City. So the thought that it happened here, where it was going to be okay, the relationship went through a bad time because John would listen to the doctor and then try to control what I was doing. I kept trying to tell him it couldn't be controlled. Could we just let go of this? But he tried, A for effort, and I think he was scared of losing me. I came as close to death as I want to be for a little while, but it did something for me. Believe it or not, there's a calmness that has come over me. Things in my life have changed. John doesn't think I'm calm, but the rest of the world, neither does Janiza, but the rest of the world's catching up with it. I've become selective. There was a time I'd be out trying to control every addict who's using and bringing them in. We have this recovery place in Kona, and I went up there the other night, and they were having a big group because the person who was there a week was going to split, so all this drama was going on and all these groups, and I called the counselor outside because she's a friend of mine, and I said, why don't you make life easier on you? Now, I did it with my sense of humor, and it's not the way I mean it. I said, fuck him. Let him go out. He's going to use again, and if he doesn't die, he's going to be back here next week. What are you aggravating the shit out of yourself for? I don't have this need to get everybody clean, see you when I see you. If you want it, it's here. But I also realize I'm not the one going to get them clean. There's a power greater than us, but we have a kind of rough time with that. They're going to get clean when they get clean. I know somebody's going to personalize me saying this, but it's not meant personal because you weren't the only person I have done this to. John thinks it's really hard that I do this to people, but there are people who've called me up and I've said, I really don't want to discuss this. I can't take it all in anymore. And there's things that I'm real selective. My time has become precious in my life. There's things I'll talk about, there's things I don't want to be bothered. And sometimes people are really looking for answers, I'm there. If you got to go find your own answers, go. I can't be involved because I don't have the energy anymore that I used to have. The most wonderful part that NA has given me was traveling all over this country to speak for NA. And tonight I said to John, this is my last. And Mary kind of knew it. At dinner, Mary said to me, this is your swan song, isn't it? I said, yep. Once at a convention, a guy named Pete was doing the spiritual meeting, and he said to me, gotta ask you a question. When you get asked to speak, do you just say, yeah, because it's service, and you're meant to do that, and you have to? I said, hell no. I get up there, and my energy takes off, and it's a high beyond any. I love being up there. And he laughed. He says, you're the only fucking one I know who's ever been honest about that. It's gone. It took a lot of work to go to Alaska the last time, and it took a lot of work for me to be able to hold it together, to be up here tonight. The work is no longer worth it. This is the last convention I will ever speak at. And one of the things Phyllis said to me was, you have been around and you have taken care of all of us for a lot of years. It's time to sit back. People have come to take care. I got to tell you about one. I had to go in for a procedure in Hilo Hospital, and it was a procedure where I had to lay flat on my back for 8 hours and I couldn't move. So somebody I sponsor comes showing up, Terry, and she hangs out with me and she proceeds to tell the nurse, I'll feed her, because I had to eat. And the nurse was so grateful she didn't have to take time out. Terry had some stuff she hadn't cleared up in her steps. So I want to tell you how she did it. She put a little bit of food on the spoon and she said to me, Fran, I didn't tell you, bop, 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 and she shoved the food in my mouth. She spent 1 hour shoving food in my mouth, telling me everything that she had never told me. And she won. I couldn't say anything back. I had a mouthful of food and I was choking. The women have all been special. I have sponsored Phyllis for 11 years or more. And she came, and I guess the women here needed to hear what she had to say because they think I'm rough on them. Phyllis was around at the worst time of my life. I had somebody ask me to sponsor them who was going over to BISAC not too long ago, and I said, sweetheart, you need to rethink it. Because you know this democracy you think you live in? She said, yeah. I said, not when you come my way. It's called total dictatorship in the beginning. Be ready for it or go someplace else. She went someplace else. And she was smart. They used to kid my sponsees saying they thought I sponsored a whole lot of women until they realized the other women were smart. They were the only idiots that asked me. But the man in my life, Father Dan, once said to me, there'll come a time where you need to take it in, and there won't be a whole lot to give out. But I have a whole lot of gratitude for what this program gave me. One of the things that I always loved that Dan said was that he believed with all his heart that he used to hear this story that addicts were suicidal, and the reason they used drugs was to die. And he said it was the biggest fallacy he had ever heard in his life. That every addict he ever met was in such pain in their life that they wanted to get rid of the pain, so they went seeking where there was none, in addiction. So they didn't want to die, they just wanted to live better. And the other thing he always said is, we were the most spiritual people he ever met. We just knocked on the wrong door. And he's given me so much of that. And there's a peaceful part coming in my life. And I'll probably miss the glory. John walks around the house and he looks at all the cups. I've always had a cup from any place I spoke. And I've spoke in dozens of cities. And John walks around the house saying, the star has fallen, the star has fallen. And he fucks with me about it. But there is a peace in my life. When I went to Alaska last month, I realized that I don't want to leave Kona. I don't even want to go to Oahu. I hate it. I see the traffic. I see the car. I'm at this point moving from Kailua, an hour and a half down south. I never thought I could do something like that. But it's the peace that's in here. The people that are the greatest with me since the stroke are the kids that I work with. Adolescents are wonderful. They know I'm forgetting things. They know I'm fucking up words. I walk around with this teacup, and whenever the kids on campus see me and I don't have the cup in my hand, one of them will stop me and say, Fran, where'd you leave the cup? And they go back and they backtrack for me. I feel kind of sorry for Janisa sometimes because it's the gang kids that I work with. And Janisa was out one night with a boy in town in a car, and she came home saying, Mom, I feel such shame, such shame. I said, why? And the head of the biggest gang on the west side went over to the car where she was with this boy and told the boy, get her home at 10, it's her curfew. So all the gang kids watch out because they know she's mine, so she can't go nowhere. So she gets a little embarrassed in town that all the boys are sending her home. Life is good for me in Kona, and it's where I plan on spending the rest of my life. But to all of you who've been such a part of this life, for all of you who've made me what I am, I have such gratitude for you. And thank you to NA for giving me a place where I could be Fran an addict. Thank you. I forgot one thing. Oh, yeah. Last Sunday on November 10th, I celebrated 30 years clean.